And today I am going to speak on the topic Black Leadership Plan. Black Leadership Plan. Often I run into discussions um, with people um, about Black history and the period of antiquity, ancient times, and what kinds of contributions Black people made to human civilization. And one of the things that that is always interesting to me is that as you talk to people, you begin to recognize the impact of uh, several hundred years of propaganda and disinformation um, regarding Black people that attempt to defame Black people, and the extent to which that defamation has an impact on the current population and how we think about our history. And in all honesty, uh, when you go around and you talk to people generally and you talk to different groups of people, what you really discover is that there are very few people that have broken through the propaganda barrier. There are very few who have overcome the glass ceiling created by this historic disinformation campaign that has been launched against the Black community to defame Black people and cast Black people as inferior or subhuman or in some way of being lesser developed than others. Um, it's actually a extensive topic to study and to delve into, because there's been so many different efforts to defame Black people. I mean, we can go back and see the beginning of racialized chattel slavery actually started in about 652 CE with the Arab invasion of Nubia. They first conquered Egypt and then they set their sights south. And this marked the beginning of the trans-Sahara slave trade that was based on race, a racialized version of the trans-Sahara slave trade that actually started it as a large-scale commercial project that expanded as the footprint of the Islamic Empire expanded. So expanded the number of Africans taken into slavery from sub-Saharan Black Africa through the trans-Sahara slave trade. And during this time, they developed a doctrine associated with the so-called curse of Ham or curse of Canaan. And it actually was something that was found in a set of Arabic rabbinical writings called the Israeliyat that were actually outside of and separate from, for example, the Jewish Talmud or the Babylonian Talmud. And these were part of a writing group that was within the Arabic culture. And so there was a man by the name of Kabal Abar who actually began to promote this, and it then became part of Islamic law. And Black people were then relegated to a position of slavery because they were deemed to be subhuman and cursed. And then, of course, that doctrine gave way to what was called the Seven Zones Theory. And this Seven Zones Theory that is most prominently written about by Ibn al-Khaldun in the 14th century hypothesized or argued, in essence, that Black people, because of the climatic condition that they came up in, in a hot subtropical humid environment, that their development was suppressed, that their brains were baked, and they came out with all kinds of arguments. And Ibn al-Khaldun actually, you know, classified black people as less than full human beings. And so this became part of their culture, and it resulted in, over a period of time, about 11 million sub-Saharan black Africans being taken into slavery through the trans-Sahara slave trade. It also resulted in about 9 million black people from sub-Saharan black Africa taken into slavery through the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade. And this was, you know, in the Islamic world. And if you look at the expansion of the footprint of the Islamic caliphates and see the Rashidun Empire and how it expanded and gave way to the Umayyad Empire, and it continued to expand into the Abbasid Empire. During the Abbasid Empire, in about 869, the largest slave rebellion in human history is documented to have occurred in Basra, Iraq, the so-called Zanj Rebellion. And this is where about 500,000 black East Africans staged a rebellion to being enslaved in Basra, Iraq. And this was a region that was involved in sugar plantations. It was involved in a number of different cash crops, as well as mining and other labor that was imposed upon black East Africans. And the black East Africans rebelled and staged this rebellion for nearly 20 years. And they were ultimately defeated by the Abbasid Caliphate. But it's a note in history for us to look at and examine and understand this period of time and what happened and the doctrines surrounding it. But by about 1591, Songhai was invaded by the Arab Sultan of Morocco. And of course, he used mercenary troops from Portugal, from Spain, and other groups. And they went in and they destroyed the infrastructure of Songhai, and it broke up into multiple other smaller factional groups. But part of this process was they actually arrested Ahmed Baba, who was the head of the University of Sankore in Timbuktu. And his crime was sedition, because he preached against the enslavement of sub-Saharan black Africans purely on the basis of race. And especially after they had adopted or accepted Islam, he believed that it violated the Quran in basic fundamental principles in Islam to enslave black people on that basis. And of course, he was considered a heretic, and he was actually in prison for 12 years in Morocco as a result of his position and his argument. And then, of course, they went in, and then you saw the Fulani jihads, and you saw the development of the House of States. You saw the development and spread of Islam and Islamic jihads throughout Africa. And during this period of time, you also see that the Sultan of Morocco, the Arab Sultan of Morocco, actually forms an alliance with England. And during this time, they began to sell Africans to England, and England becomes involved in the transatlantic slave trade, and ultimately they become colonists and begin a colonial empire overseas. But before they began their colonial empire, they simply engaged in trafficking and sale of sub-Saharan black Africans taken into slavery, first through Berbers and Arabs, and then they began to operate independently on their own. So when we began to look at this history and see all during this time, these doctrines that developed that were part of the Arab Islamic slave trades that took place through the trans-Sahara slave trade and the East African Indian Ocean slave trade. And then we see the transatlantic slave trade come in, and it begins, we see that we have Pope Martin actually authorizes the Portuguese to enslave sub-Saharan black Africans through a 1455 papal bull. And then subsequent to that, we see the Treaty of Tordesillas, and we see the division of the world between Spain and Portugal by the Catholic Church. And then after that, we see the full-scale transatlantic slave trade. And then we see Europeans fight amongst themselves, and we see the 200 years of European wars of religion, and they fight amongst each other in order to try to dominate and control Africa, the slave trade, and take possession and control of Africans' mineral wealthy lands. And then we see it culminate in the Berlin Conference of 1884 and see Africa divided into colonial territories and divided among Europeans. And then as we watch how this history unfolds, we can track the doctrines that develop. Because you can see, of course, the Israeliyat and the Ham doctrines, and then you see the seven zones theory within the Arab community. And then you see, subsequent to that, among Europeans, they developed what's called the Teutonic origins theory, the Aryan supremacy theory. There's the Piltdown scholars, and there's a host of different doctrines that come forward to try to render black people as subhuman. Even in South America and Argentina, the Italians and others who were associated with them came up with something called the Out of America theory. What they did was they classified Africans in the Aboriginal Australians as Homo ater, and said that they were subhuman, that they were not fully developed humans. And these doctrines, spread, and then ultimately you had Arnold Toynbee develop what was called a study of history, which was a 12-volume set of writings where Arnold Toynbee, a British scholar, actually claimed that he studied 21 civilizations around the world. And of these 21 civilizations that he studied, that the, quote, Negro did not make a creative contribution to any of the 21 civilizations. And of course, all of this was false doctrine. It was all propaganda. But he got his picture on the cover of Time magazine in 1947, and his doctrines became part of the American educational system, as well as the educational systems across Europe and colonial Africa. And so it was a propaganda campaign to damage the psyche and understanding of black people. But we had multiple scholars that researched and dug through and unraveled the history and came forward with irrefutable evidence and doctrine. People like Professor Cheikh Anta Diop and many others. And for example, Professor Diop established that from pre-dynastic times in ancient Egypt to the 14th dynasty, that ancient Egypt was an indigenous black African achievement, and that all the early kings were indigenous black Africans, and the vast majority of the population were indigenous black Africans. And then we see later invasions of Egypt. We see the Phoenician invasion, we see the Hyksos invasion, we see the Assyrian invasion and the Babylonian invasion and the Persian invasion, the Greek invasion, the Roman invasion, the Vandal invasion, the Arab invasion, the Mamluk invasion, which are Turks. And we see all these waves of invasions of people that come in. And of course, it not only changed Egypt, but it changed the complexion of North Africa overall. And so North Africa became a population that spoke Afro-Asiatic language. They became connected to Europe and Asia. But sub-Saharan black Africa remained isolated because of the vast Sahara desert. And sub-Saharan black Africans spoke Bantu languages. They spoke Niger-Congo in Nilotic languages that were all connected to Bantu. And then you look all across sub-Saharan black Africa, and this is the distinctive population that was targeted. This is the group that was the subject of the racialized enslavement and of all three of the major slave trades. And black Americans, about 95% of black America's African ancestors come from sub-Saharan black Africa. And when we look at this and look at the evidence, a little less than 5% come from Southeast Africa and Madagascar. And generally, black Americans' ancestors, and that's whether we're in North America, Central America, South America, or the Caribbean, that our ancestors generally come from 3 to 5 regions in sub-Saharan black Africa. And it is very rare that you have any significant North African presence in the DNA of black people in the Americas. And the reason is because we were taken from sub-Saharan black Africa, and North Africans, who were Berbers and Arabs, were part of the perpetrators of the enslavement of black people and the promotion of the disinformation campaigns that were designed to humiliate black people, to make us forget our history and our heritage. But when you go back and you look at the work of Professor Sheikh Anta Diop, as I mentioned, and you look at Dr. Yosef Ben-Yochanan, you look at Professor John Henry Clark and Theophilo Bingo, and a host of other researchers that in essence unraveled this mystery, as well as a number of Europeans who unraveled the mystery. The fact is that the ancient Egyptian high culture was an indigenous black African high culture that started in the south, in the Nubian region, and then it spread and expanded north. And this is why you see all of the, like Abydos, and you see all of these places in the south. And this is where you have the major burial grounds. This is where you see all the beginning of all of the monumental works. This is the beginning of the mathematics, the medical technology, the pyramid building period. This is where they have the Abydos boats or Abydos ships, showing that black people had seafaring capability. This is when the astronomy was developed. This is the ancient high culture of ancient Egypt actually began in the south, and this is what everyone sought after in terms of the rest of the world, why everyone wanted to invade Egypt and possess Egypt, because Egypt was the crown jewel of humanity. It actually produced a high culture that is the prototype of modern human civilization. It produced the scientific method. It produced, algebra and trigonometry. It produced medical technology, where there was studies of the treatment of abscesses and burns, and pulse and circulation, studies in gynecology. There was studies in optics. There were studies in dentistry. There was dentistry going on during this time. And during this particular time, they went in and began to look in these tombs, and when they go into a tomb, typically they find things that are artifacts from a person's life, and everyone had an afro comb, and I think that's a telling thing, the fact that they all had these afro combs. And then when you go and look to the Bible, for example, it talks about the Ancient of Days, and this Ancient of Days it's a motif that you'll find all across sub-Saharan black Africa. And this Ancient of Days is this ancient black character, and he has hair as lamb's wool. He's depicted as a elderly black man. He sits on the throne. In the Bible, for example, in the book of Daniel, he's described. It says the Ancient of Days did sit. And his hair was as lamb's wool. And it goes on and it talks about the Son of Man that came before him, and that the Son of Man was given a kingdom, his son, the son of the Ancient of Days. And so when we look at this, he's described as having hair of lamb's wool, and feet as brass as if burnt in an oven. And when we examine this, we're talking about dark black people with an afro that this characteristics of sub-Saharan black Africa. And so when we began to closely examine this and look all across different cultures, it all traces back into this development of these people from sub-Saharan black Africa. And when we go back even further, you hear about Göbekli Tepe and Kirihan Tepe in Turkey, in the Anatolia region of Turkey. You hear about Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in India. But when you begin to delve into a genuine, serious study, which you'll find out about what's called Afad 23. And Afad 23 actually goes back 70,000 years. It's the oldest settlement of a well-preserved settlement of humans that goes back further than any place else on the earth. There's no parallel to it. And so we find that the evidence where black people were domesticating cattle, they had homes with a hearth in it where they cooked their food. They had farmland, and they had community workshops where they actually manufactured tools and other products. And this is in the Dongola region of Sudan. This in Nubia, in this region, this below Egypt, of what became Egypt. And so we can see this beginning of this black culture that moves north, that arises in the south and moves north and becomes Egypt. And then it's like a tree of life springs forth and basically gives shade to the world and gives nutrition and nurturance in terms of spirituality and science and philosophy and art. And you can even go to the Bible, for example, and look at, for example, you go through the stories in the Bible, and you can find parallels of every story in the Bible that existed for thousands of years before the Bible was ever written. You can do the same thing with the Quran and look at the stories in the Quran and see their original stories. And so all of these stories are ultimately remakes of earlier African stories. There are even sections, for example, in the Bible that are like in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes that are copied verbatim from ancient African texts like the Maxims of Ptahhotep and the Maxims of Amenhotep. And so when we start looking at this and begin to really closely examine this history and think in terms of this ideal of black leadership, one of the things that we'll find is that in the earliest times, the major emphasis of black people and black leadership was the promotion of what was called ma'at. And ma'at simply is balance. It is a order. It is the harmonious community. It is the design of a harmonious community. And this was the goal of black leadership from very early times. And so they recognized the nature of humanity, and they recognized the value in moving in a direction that would be inclusive of all humanity, that would spread technology all around the world, and that would bring enlightenment and success to people. And so they also recognized from very early times what was called the Great Year. And the Great Year is actually built around what's called the precession of the equinoxes. And it's about a 26,000 year period of time that if you look at it as a model, so to speak, what you'll see is that the earth moves around the sun. The moon goes around the earth goes around the sun, and then the sun travels in a path where there are 12 major constellations that are a band around the center of the earth, and there are 4 major constellations in the north. And this is where the whole concept of a wheel within a wheel comes from, that we see in the book of Ezekiel. We see it repeated a number of times, but this is the mathematical structure and understanding of the movement of the earth and sun within this galaxy. And as a consequence of this structure, this model of this great year that was developed very early on, the concept of an eon or age was developed, so that there were ages or eons that lasted a little less than 2,200 years for an eon or age. And each of these ages were later associated with a constellation. And so this became a way to understand the universe and its structure. And of course, later people distorted it and created a mythology around it and created astrology and all kinds of pseudosciences. But in the beginning, this wasn't about astrology. It wasn't a pseudoscience. It was a hard science that was based upon understanding where we are in time and space. And this precision enabled black people to build the pyramids. It enabled them to have the mathematical precision to be able to determine coordinates on the ground. So they had a system that was a GPS type of system in ancient times where they understood where they were in time and space and where they were mathematically. And so as a consequence of that, they developed this capacity to travel anywhere in the world and to be able to return back to their point of origin based upon mathematical principles. And so this was, when we go back and look at all of this and study this history and see black leadership during this particular time, the black leadership plan was always about building a harmonious community. And so when you begin to go back and start studying other cultures around the world, you'll find a mythology in the Americas, you'll find it in Asia, you'll find it in Polynesia, you'll find it all over the planet, where all of these different groups of people have some story, some mythology that says that the gods came in ships. And they depict a boat where these people came to them, and they came in boats. And where they made images of them, the images of them are always have features that indicate black people. And so when we go back and see the Abydos ships, 3100 BC, and we don't see any parallel to that anywhere else in the world, it becomes very clear who had the capacity to travel during that time and who had the ability and the science and technology in place to be able to do that. So when we look at that and we understand the peopling of the earth, and we can see the so-called haplogroups move out and spread out all across the planet, and we see the development of civilization around the world, we look at the misinformation promoted by the British scholar Arnold Toynbee in his 12-volume set called a Study of History. We began to recognize that this effort to defame black people, in this effort to set us back and to destroy us and all of this, that when we look at it in a historical context and we think in terms of black leadership, there's an ancient saying. We read about it in the Bible, but it actually is part of the wisdom literature of ancient Egypt. And it says, where there is no vision, the people perish. So what was the vision of black leadership? And if we closely examine the literature and the writings, what we find is that the vision of black leadership was the beloved community. It was global harmony, global unity. And why? Why did this exist? And when you begin to take a look at and understand where we are today and think of what we've learned today, that we've learned about the geological history of the world, and we now know about the asteroid impacts that took place and how the dinosaurs were wiped out as a result of the asteroid impact. And we go back and look at the impact of climate change, and we recognize the ice ages, and we see the geological history of the earth. We can go back and decipher that. And so when you go back and begin to look at the history, it becomes very clear that black people knew about this stuff during these ancient times. They were aware of the geological history of the earth. They were aware of the threats that existed to the planet itself. And when you look at, for example, even in the science of pyramid building and the alignment with the stars, Ulna and Rigel, and you see some of the things that they did in terms of to promote the ideal of a immortal soul, a man being a light being at his best, and being able to really recognize this significance of our place in the within the universe, that black people were very conscious of this. And this is why, for example, you see things like Tutankhamun. You see the imagery of his mother, a black woman, Queen T, and you see his dagger. He has a dagger that's made of an alloy that many people claim came from an asteroid, because it's made of a mineral substance that is foreign to the earth. And there's his dagger, the Tutankhamun, the Tutankhamun dagger. And so we see these kinds of things, these kind of artifacts, and we look at these things and put them in context, and we look at some of the old stories and try to look at, well, what did they see? What did they think? What was their view? What were they trying to achieve? I think that we're trying to move in the direction of building a global harmonious community. And when we look at this, we see actually the world go through a major period of chaos. And we see this period of time where you have the various different rulerships. You have the Babylonians, they become a dominant power, and then you have the Syrians become a dominant power. You have the Persians become a dominant power. You have the Greeks become a dominant power, and the Romans become a dominant power, and the Arabs become a dominant power. You have all these dominant powers come along that are non-African, and even Egypt was taken over and became non-African at a certain point in terms of the people who actually had control over it. But the people who originally built all of this faded into the background, and they moved into sub-Saharan Black Africa and spread out across the continent, the so-called Bantu migrations. And we see this group of people that are spread out, and they are ultimately taken into slavery. They're taken through the Trans-Sahara slave trade, the East Africa Indian Ocean slave trade, and the transatlantic slave trade. And they're spread out all over the world. And today, there are as many as 700 million black people of African descent in the African diaspora. And you have many groups of people who don't claim to be African, because being an African was a badge of dishonor at one point. So you have people who have very significant amounts of African DNA, but they don't claim to be African. Many claim to be some of everything else. And you see a trend happening even in the United States, where black Americans now are denying their African heritage. And it's part of a trend that has taken place in former colonial societies, where being black and being African was associated with negativity. It was something that was frowned upon because of what happened to black people and the propaganda campaign against black people. There's also about 1.3 billion sub-Saharan Africans on the African continent. And so when we began to look at this, we're talking about a population of about 2 billion people worldwide, including 1.3 billion on the African continent. And when we look at this, I recall being in a discussion with a great scholar on the African continent, Professor Adia J. And he said that the day will come when everybody on this planet will claim African heritage. They'll want to be associated with Africa because Africa itself will rise, and that Africa itself will become associated with power and glory and greatness. And then everyone will want to be a part of it. And those people who are hiding and running today to try to hide their African heritage, they will come out and be proud of their African heritage. And so I remember that conversation, and I thought about that conversation and looked at it within the context of history. And when we actually began to closely examine this history, we go back to in terms of to try to put all of this in context. When we think in terms of black leadership, a black leadership plan, in about 1897, there was a group of black people that organized. They called themselves the Africa Association, and they organized in London, England. And there was Henry Sylvester Williams. He was a lawyer, a black lawyer from Trinidad, and he was the main leader. There was Alice Kinloch, and she was from South Africa, and there was a number of other people, including Benita Sylvan, who was from Haiti. And he represented Haiti and at one point also represented Ethiopia. And there were a number of people that came together, this small group of black people representing multiple countries around the world. And they came together and began to have discussions and to talk about the conditions of black people worldwide. They talked about what was happening on the African continent. And during this time, there were atrocities going on in the so-called Belgian Congo. And this is where some 15 million black people were unalived in the Congo in order to develop rubber plantations and to exploit the mineral wealth of the African continent. And black people were enslaved there under King Leopold of Belgium. In addition to that, in Southeast Africa, Cecil Rhodes became the richest man in the world, the head of De Beers Diamond Company. And they were essentially exterminating black people, like the Matabele people. They used what they call the Maxim gun, which shot 600 rounds a minute, to unalive black people. And in addition to that, in Southwest Africa, the Germans were there, and they were conducting a genocide of the Herero and Nama people. They operated concentration camps in Shark Island, and they committed all kinds of atrocities against black people. And then you had Lord Kitchener coming through Sudan, exterminating people, in essence using what was called the Maxim guns. They'd have multiple Maxim guns, and they'd come and literally fire thousands of rounds into crowds of black people at a time. And this is what was going on in the world when this Africa Association began to meet and talk about what is happening on the African continent. They were acutely aware of the atrocities being committed against black people on the African continent. They were acutely aware of what was going on in the United States of America, because there was Jim Crow segregation going on. There had just been the Wilmington Massacre, and there was a long history of massacres of black people. Whole black communities and black towns were wiped out. Black people were in Jim Crow segregation. Lynching was at an all-time high. And in addition to that, in the Caribbean, black people were submitted to systems that were tantamount to slavery, and they were forced labor. They were subjected to extreme violence, and all kinds of things were taking place to subjugate the black people within the British Empire. In addition to that, these were conditions that existed all around the world where black communities existed. And at that time, there was a saying that the sun would not set on the British Empire. It was the largest empire in the history of the world. It had the largest land footprint. And when you look at this, you had black people that were subjugated in lands all over the world. And in addition, you had people that had been taken to Indonesia from Africa, to Sri Lanka, to India, you had all these different slave trades that were involved in subjugating black people. And during that time, the Ottoman Empire was still in power, and throughout the Arab Islamic world, black people were enslaved throughout the Islamic world, the Arab Islamic world, even though slavery had been outlawed in the British Empire. And so when we look at the conditions that existed, this group called the Africa Association, they represented a global consciousness of black people, because they had people from all over the black world, people that lived all over the place, came together in England. And then they invited people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Bishop Alexander Walters, who was a African Methodist Church bishop in the United States, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a world-renowned scholar already at that time. And they organized what was called the First Pan-African Conference. And at this First Pan-African Conference, they also invited Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington didn't attend the actual conference, but he wrote the invitation to invite delegates and people from all over the world, black people from all over the world. And he was at that time considered a prominent black American, and his endorsement attracted many people. And so as a consequence of this African Association, they conducted what was called the First Pan-African Conference in England in 1900. And this First Pan-African Conference, the secretary of the conference was Henry Sylvester Williams, the Trinidadian barrister, lawyer. Bishop Alexander Walters chaired the conference, and W.E.B. Du Bois played a major role in the conference in that he created a historical document called Address to the Nations of the World. And this is very significant, and many people studying black history, it's a stage in terms of in the journey of the study of black history. We look at this address, the Address to the Nations of the World. And it is probably one of the most, if not the most significant and turning event in history. Because what is happening is Du Bois is coming forward with this document that was actually adopted by the entire conference, this First Pan-African Conference. And what he did was he put forth this claim, this argument. He said that the 20th century would be the question of the 20th century would be the question of the color line. And in this color line issue, he talked about a global color line, because he talked about racial discrimination practiced by Europeans and Americans against the darker skinned people of the world, including Africa, Asia, and the Americas. So he included all of the different peoples of color in the world. Even though they focused primarily on Africa, they recognized all the other groups of people that were impacted by this, and they embraced them. And actually, India even sent a delegate to participate, so that India itself, the black people that lived in India, were represented in the conference. But what they did was they made a plea for responsible government, responsible leadership. And what they did was they identified and highlighted what was going on in the world and the kinds of morally reprehensible things that were happening to black people worldwide. And of course, this had never been done before. No one came forward before, and even though there were maybe isolated things or talked about, isolated situations that happened, to black people, no one actually wove it all together to be able to identify it as a global phenomena, as a global situation that was going on. And what Du Bois did was appeal to all the nations of the world, including the Queen of England and the heads of state of governments all around the world. So this was an address to the nations of the world. And many people, argue that this is part of this global discussion actually led to the League of Nations and then ultimately the United Nations, because this was the voice of black people that rose up in the earth to talk about what is going on and to shine a light on the global conditions that existed and what was happening to black people around the world. And so what Du Bois did in this document, what the conference did in essence, represented by, representation from multiple different places in the black community throughout Africa and the diaspora, they demanded that the colonial nations treat Africans with human dignity. With human dignity. They demanded this. And they also demanded that they be allowed to conduct education, that their land rights be respected, rather than treating them as cheap, exploitable labor. Treat us with dignity and respect as human beings. And, let's work together in harmony and to build a global community. And so this became a very important call, because this was black people now whose voice was silent for generations. There was no global black voice. People didn't hear the voice of black people globally. Now, for the first time in centuries, the world is hearing black voices. The international press is reporting this conference and what these black people are saying. And so now people all around the world who in many cases were unaware of the kinds of atrocities being committed by their governments. They were unaware of the inhumanity that was occurring. They were unaware of some of these things, and they lived in a bubble. They were isolated. Now these people are now becoming aware because of this address to the nations of the world. This conversation that started. And this is a group of black people coming together as a collective voice, a collective black leadership that's coming forward, and they're speaking to the global community. And now they have started a conversation and that can't turn back. Now this global conversation now is black people talking about the plight of black people and the plight of other people of color in the world. So black people become a spokesperson, a voice for human rights, a voice for fair treatment, a voice for equity and fairness, a voice for ma'at, balance. So they've actually come full circle, and they're now reviving an ancient concept that was called ma'at in the ancient days. But today they're just presenting it and presenting the factual basis for it. And so when we look at this, they also, in this first Pan-African conference, demanded that European countries and Asian countries and other countries around the world, that they respect the sovereignty of Ethiopia, of Haiti, and of Liberia, which were three independent black countries at that time, three independent sovereign black countries. And they called for and demanded that these three countries be treated fairly and protected and not be attacked and marginalized because there were a bunch of people trying to attack them. Ethiopia had just defeated Italy's attacks in the Battle of Adwa in 1896, where they tried to attack and subdue Ethiopia, but they were unsuccessful. There were efforts to try to damage and destroy Haiti and take it, because Haiti had become an independent black country that was slaves rebelled and created their own country. And then, of course, Liberia had been a colony that had got its independence. But in terms of looking at what was going on in the global black community, black people worldwide recognized the sovereignty of Ethiopia, the sovereignty of Haiti. They recognized the importance of these in the global picture of things. And they demanded freedom, justice, and equality for people, black people all over the world. And so they demanded the equality of African Americans as well. So they demanded a full constitutional and civil rights. They demanded an end to Jim Crow segregation. They demanded an end to the system of strategic violence and discrimination against black people in the United States. And so this global conference that took place became a collective voice of black people worldwide. They also advocated for moving toward full self-government of black people, so that black people would become self-governing and that they would be integrated into the nations of the world. In other words, they could engage in trade and commerce with everyone else on equal terms. This was a big demand at this time, and this was the voice of black people emerging. And so this laid the groundwork and the blueprint for the Pan-African movement. This was the beginning and founding of the Pan-African movement. And it transformed local struggles, local colonial struggles that people had in local countries like in the United States or in colonial territories, in the Caribbean of Britain, or colonial territories in other parts of the world of Britain or France or Germany or the Dutch or those. That it transformed those local conflicts into a unified global political front. So black people worldwide now were speaking as one voice. And so after that, there was an effort to try to suppress the conference and the leaders of this conference and all those things. But black people prevailed. But it wasn't until 1919 that they held the first Pan-African Congress. And so after World War I, and they organized this first Pan-African Congress. And this first Pan-African Congress, led and organized by W.E.B. Du Bois, was the next significant milestone in the Pan-African movement. Because what it did was it started a process where there were 5 Pan-African Congresses that ultimately led to the 1945 Pan-African Congress, and it actually opened up what was called the African Liberation Movement. And then you had the rise of 54 independent black nations on the African continent. And then when we go back and look at this period of time and examine what is happening, you have to go back and look at, for example, in World War I. Many people look at World War I and they hear about the Austrian, I guess the Duke or whatever was of the Austria or whatever was unalived, and his assassination, it set off World War I and all that. But in reality, most people don't closely examine, because if you take a close look at what happened, European countries had limited resources. They had limited natural resources. And their wealth actually came from slavery, the enslavement of black people, in overseas colonies and territories where they extracted the wealth of other people. And Germany actually controlled, if you look at the alliance, you had Germany, you had the Ottomans, and Austria-Hungary, and that they were the powers that were in opposition to the Allied forces. They were on one side, and then England, France, and the United States, and a number of other countries were on the other side, and they were, this was a global war that developed. And when we look at it, at bottom, Germany had a stake in Africa because they had colonies in Togo, they had part of Ghana, they had parts of Uganda and Tanzania, they had Southwest Africa, they had part of Cameroon. they had major territories all across the African continent. And these major territories was the primary source of their wealth. It was the primary source of their industrialization. And they would not have been a significant power at all had it not been for access to these resources. And some of their trading partners included Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans. And then, of course, the Ottomans, they still had people that were enslaved, even though they had only recently ended the slave trade. Their empire was built upon the enslavement of black people, sub-Saharan black Africans. And when you look at the whole economic equation that existed, that these powers derived their power from the exploitation of Africa. So Africa was at the very heart and center of the conflict. And what did they fight over? They fought over Africa. And though the theater of Europe was a place that was a battleground, the major battle took place on the African continent. And there were about 350 or so thousand black Americans who fought in World War I on behalf of the United States and the Allied forces. There were about 2.3 million Africans from the African continent who fought. And so in terms of Africa was the major theater of war. And many people don't recognize the significance of this, and that what Germany lost, when Germany lost the war in World War I, they lost their African territories. That was the issue. They lost their African territories. And once they lost their African territories, their economy went into disarray because they didn't have the resources that they had access to before when they had their African colonies. And then in addition to that, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. So global Islam collapsed at that time. And of course, they had groups they tried to spin off once the caliphate was actually dismantled in 1924. Groups set up the Islamic Brotherhood in Egypt to try to spread Islam. The groups like the Nation of Islam was formed in the United States, and they used an Ottoman flag and turned it reverse so that the sun and moon would be in a different direction, but it was an Ottoman flag. And so when we began to go back and look at the history of what happened, and we see the overthrow of these forces, this was the collapse of a global empire that enslaved black people and that continued the major exploitation of black people. And even though both sides were involved in the exploitation of black people, what happened is that in World War I, Germany lost its African territories. And so you saw a shift in the balance of global power. And in addition to that, you saw, for example, North Africa was defeated by the French. Most of the so-called Middle East became French in British protectorates. And you begin to look at the global community as it's unfolding and see that the African continent now is primarily under British, American, and other control in terms of European control. And so even though America did not directly hold territories, it did so by proxy and by relationship with European powers who controlled. And also the same thing with Russia. Many people say, well, Russia, never enslaved anybody. But the fact of the matter is that Russia had a seat at the Berlin Conference. They were participants in the dividing of African colonial territory. They were major financial recipients of it. It's just that they were not in direct proximity in order to make it feasible for them to enslave Africans. They enslaved other groups of people. But when we go back and look at and examine this history, they had just as much culpability and involvement in terms of the subjugation of the African continent. as any of the other European groups. They were seated at the table at the Berlin Conference and voted in order to allow all these atrocities to happen against black people. But when we look at this picture of things and understand this history of what's going on, there is a black voice that has become more and more developed, has began to speak out and become louder and louder on the international stage. That they have a voice now on the international stage. They have a voice now in the global community. And this voice is becoming more crystal clear. And so at the end of or during World War II, there was about 1.2 million black Americans participated on behalf of the Allied forces. In addition to that, there was another 1.2 or more million Africans who participated on behalf of the Allied forces. And when you look at it, again, what was World War II all about? They were fighting over resources. They were fighting over the resources that were coming out of Africa. They were fighting over control of the foundation of the global economy. And so in terms of, this was a fight for control of the global economy. And when we look at this, Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt recognized this. And they sat down and they formed something called the Atlantic Compact. And what they did was they agreed that at the end of the war, when World War II ended, that they would work to promote the independence of African countries, because they felt that colonialism, they felt that being able to continue to subjugate black people, that this was a losing proposition, that black people were becoming too sophisticated in World War I and World War II. Black people, they fought alongside white people, and they saw that white people are not invincible. They bleed, and they are subject to fear and everything else. And so they recognized the black community, the mystique of YT people and YT society was gone. And what happened is black people now were demanding directly freedom, justice, and equality. And they weren't going to accept no for an answer. They were ready to go the distance, to do whatever it took to achieve this. And so the African liberation movement emerged. And then you see Nkrumah become the president of an independent Ghana. You see Sekou Touré become the president of an independent Guinea. You see Azikiwe become the president of an independent Nigeria. And then you see this spread, and by 1963, there were about 35 independent African countries that formed what became known as the Organization of African Unity. And this Organization of African Unity put forth a vision of a unified Africa, of a federated Africa, of a United States of Africa. And they had two different groups that had come to the table to form the Organization of African Unity. They had what's called the Monrovia Group, and they had the Casablanca Group. And the Casablanca Group was more dominated with the Arab and Berber North, and the Monrovia Group primarily consisted of indigenous sub-Saharan black African populations. And of course, the sub-Saharan black Africans were the majority, and their view prevailed, and they organized the Organization of African Unity. And then, of course, Malcolm X comes into the picture and organizes the Organization of African American Unity and makes an attempt to begin to globalize or organize black people in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States, the Caribbean, Central and South America, very similar to what Marcus Garvey had achieved through his movement, through the Universal Negro Association and African Communities League. And so Garvey had expanded a large footprint of organized black people across the Caribbean and South America, the United States, and Europe, and also on the African continent ultimately. So in terms of looking at this history and recognizing the phases it went through, its development, and the experiments and experiences that it went through. What we see is that when you take a look at this period that of the Organization of African Unity, and then we see the tie of the diaspora through Malcolm X, and this became, the most threatening thing to the Western world was not Malcolm X in the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam didn't vote. They weren't significant participants in the political process. They were critics of the civil rights movement. They were no threat to YT people whatsoever. They were a cult, that organized. And of course they had some positive impact. They did some great things in terms of cleaning up the black community and all those things. And that's wonderful. And I don't want to discount that. But the fact is that Malcolm X did not become a serious threat until he began to organize the Organization of African American Unity, because that presented a genuine threat to the United States and European power. And this was the basis of why he was ultimately unalive, no matter who actually pulled the trigger. So in terms of looking at and understanding the significance of what was going on at the time and understanding the global picture, we see that the Organization of African Unity became a very significant force in organizing Africa, because it developed a policy to allow each country to develop independently, and it promoted non-interference so that one African country would not interfere in the internal affairs of another African country. And each African country could go through whatever processes it had to do in order to fully secure its independence and sovereignty. And so this was a process. And if we look at and understand this process, there was a number of programs that operated, that had a positive impact. And we can also see that these groups of black people organized through the Organization of African Unity, they had a major impact on what happened in the rest of the world. Because now, instead of, say, for example, the United States being able to trade with Europeans who controlled the Africa as colonies, they now had to deal directly with independent African heads of state. They had to now deal directly with Africans. And so it's very difficult for the United States practicing Jim Crow segregation, lynching black people, doing all these things to, with a straight face, be able to sit down and engage in trade with the African continent. And so they were forced into passing civil rights laws and voting rights laws and ending Jim Crow segregation. And then you saw the success of the black civil rights movement. And it would have never occurred had not been for Pan-Africanism in this global movement of black people that now were making tangible progress in having these independent African countries begin to emerge. And so when we look at this and understand this in its overall context, we go back to W.E.B. Du Bois in 1900 in this first Pan-African Conference, this global group of black people who came together and spoke as one voice to the international community and spoke to heads of state of governments all around the world and began to demand change and demand human rights for black people, and that black people be treated fairly, and that black people self-govern, and that black people not be exploited and not have the kinds of atrocities that were being committed against them. And so this voice put black people at the table of the international community. And then ultimately we see this culminate in a Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And so this Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually creates something that was unprecedented in the history of the world. It creates a global consensus of the treatment of human beings, of what is proper and fair treatment of human beings. What are human rights? What are our human rights? And they made a declaration of this through the United Nations, and this resolution was largely influenced by black people. And W.E.B. Du Bois, actually the year before the resolution was passed, actually wrote a major paper that was published through the NAACP that had a major impact in terms of globally, in terms of marshaling the votes and support for a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you see Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune and a host of other blacks who were involved directly with the Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the chairperson of the committee where this Human Rights Declaration came out of at the United Nations. So when we began to look at this actual history and we see the unfolding of black leadership, we see that black leadership is now playing a major role on the global stage. And we see major progress taking place in black communities all around the world. We see Africa developing and rising. Of course, it has problems. It's gone through situations. You've got some countries where there are coups d'etats, and you got interference from Europe and America and Russia and in Arab countries are all meddling because they want to have access to this this place where this deemed the scandal of the earth, because they have a disproportionate share of the earth's mineral resources. And so in terms of looking at and understanding this global picture, what we see then is that the Organization of African Unity begins to expand, and its work begins to be carried out across the African continent. And then, of course, there's also movements that are going on in the diaspora. And even though they're not done under the banner of the Organization of African American Unity, as Malcolm had started it out, they're happening nevertheless. So black people now are connecting up. And you've got people like Walter Rodney, right? This book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. You get a global reparations movement. So you got black people in America demanding reparations. You got black people in Brazil and Colombia and other parts of Central and South America demanding reparations. You have a proliferation of black scholars around the world that are publishing and writing and doing research. And you see all these things happening. You see the designation of historical sites through UNESCO, through the United Nations. So they're acknowledging the history and creating memorials and monuments around the world talking about what happened to black people. And when you begin to really examine all of these things, you see a culmination of the Organization of African Unity, because based on the structure it had designed, it completed its work. And then in about 2001, it re-emerges as the Africa Union. And the Africa Union actually creates in its constitution, it's what they call its Constitutive Act, Region 6, and it designates the African diaspora as Region 6. And so in terms of looking at and understanding this global process that's going on, you see Africa moving toward its place in society, because what is happening now is all these other countries have had their turn. They've had a chance. They've all developed and they've all achieved and they've all done the things that they could do and build and progress. And many of them did so with great wickedness. And many of them did so and committed all kinds of atrocities against black people. But when we look at it from a global scale, what we see is Africa now emerging as the youngest group of people. In other words, it has the youngest population of people. It has the greatest economic potential of any other group of people in the world. We saw China rise, and we saw India rise, and we saw all these major groups rise. But Africa now is on the precipice of change. It's at the beginning of something major. And if we look at this, the Africa Union, they established something in 2015 called the Agenda 2063. And the Agenda 2063 will celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity. And the theme is the Africa we want. In other words, what do we want Africa to look like by 2063? And so it's a multi-decade vision operationalized through 10-year implementation plans. And so right now we are in a phase where 2026 to 2036 is deemed the decade of reparations. And so there was a resolution passed by the United Nations, unprecedented. 123 countries voted in favor of this resolution that declared that racialized chattel slavery was the gravest crime against humanity. And when we began to really look at and understand, the significance and meaning of this, right? It's very powerful in terms of to have an impact on global relations, and particularly when Africa is holding major resources. And now you have, African countries they're industrializing, they're building middle class wealth. They're no longer just a place where Europeans can come and extract resources and run and come take whatever they want out of Africa and leave, where they can exploit black people and come in and commit against atrocities against black people just so they can take their wealth. Those days are passing, and what is happening is blacks are becoming more organized on the African continent. They're building alliances with China and India, and they're becoming part of a global community where Europe and America is no longer in a position to exploit them in the way that they were in the past. And so you see what's happening on the African continent. You see that this agenda 2063 is promoting prosperity all across the African continent and in the diaspora, and it has specific plans. In addition, their global, or rather integration of the African populations and countries, so that they eliminate the cross-border barriers. So you don't have to have a passport. You can cross from one country to another, and where it's an integrated global economy, and good governance. So the AU promotes democratic principles, so that countries operate with democratic principles, so that the people have a voice in their own governance, and that this becomes a universal principle. And all countries that are part of the African Union adopts this principle. In addition to this, they're moving toward trying to develop peace and security, so that their borders are secured, that they've eliminated the internal conflicts, that they've removed the insurgencies and the outside agitators. They're working to do this and to build a cultural renaissance, so that people become aware of African history and culture across the continent as well as around the world. And so they are working toward a system of people-driven development, so that Africans all over have an opportunity to express their genius and be able to make major progress. And I was in Senegal a while back, and I was at the University of Cheikh Anta Diop, and I met a whole group of young black men from across the African continent, and they were studying engineering, and they were developing aircraft designs and aircraft engine and propulsion systems, and they were on the cutting edge of science. And NASA and the space agencies around the world were in major corporations in that industry were courting them and their skills and trying to build relationship with them, because these were young black geniuses that were on the cutting edge of change in terms of science. And so we'll see that Africa, part of the goal of the 2063 program, is to build the global influence of the African continent, so that we can promote a harmonious community. And it goes back to the original plan of African leadership from the beginning, the establishment of Ma'at, the balance, a global balanced society. So some of the key initiatives that exist, when we look at some of the key initiatives, there's the African Continental Free Trade Area. There's the integrated high-speed rail network, or to connect major African cities by high-speed rail systems. There's the Africa Passport and Free Movement of the People program. There's the Single African Air Transport market system. There's the Grand Inga hydroelectric dam, which will bring power all across Central and Southern Africa, harnessing the hydroelectric power of the most powerful river on earth, the Congo River. In addition to that, they're building the Pan-African virtual and e-university system to create an internet-based system to reach all over the continent. And in addition, when we began to take a look at what's happening, about 20 different African countries have space programs. They have launched satellites and that now have their own satellites where they are able to monitor the weather. They can see ground movements of troops and soldiers. They can see globally. They can manage GPS tracking. They can manage systems that are designed to promote their sovereignty and their independence, and to build their economic infrastructure. And we see these things happening. There's about 5 different major African auto manufacturers. There's now like Interson Motors and Katanka Motors and Kiera Motors and Mobius Motors. And you see major vehicle manufacturing, primarily electric vehicles, taking place on the African continent. In addition to that, you see the development of major highway systems being developed and bridges and infrastructure to connect the continent. And you also see the development of electrical grids. And for example, in Ethiopia, the Grand Ethiopian Hydroelectric Dam basically has the capacity to provide tremendous amount of energy to energize the whole region for industrialization. When we look at what is going on and the progress that's being made, black people are moving into the modern world. We're moving into becoming a significant player on the global stage. And this represents major opportunities for black people in the United States, for black people in the Caribbean and Central and South America, and from all around the world, as well as on the African continent, because the diaspora is deemed to be part of Region 6 of the African continent. And many African countries are already welcoming black Americans and other people from the African diaspora in opening the door for dual citizenship, or for them to be able to come home to the African continent. And when we look at this and see this overall situation and what is happening in this cooperation with groups like China and India, and we see the kinds of things that are taking place, the progress that's taking place today, what becomes, I think, most significant is recognizing the fact that black people from the very early days, in terms of looking at building a global community and what would it take to build a global community, and their assessment of this and the unfolding of the plan. When we think back of the concept of the Ancient of Days did sit, and we see this unfolding, we see the indication of a global plan. And what is this global plan all about? This black leadership plan, this really a black global leadership plan that has been in place since early times. And even though we may not always visibly see who, someone in a prominent position or whatever, it's been there. It's always there. And what is at the core of it? At the core of it is the understanding that the earth itself, if we look at the earth, we can go back and see that an asteroid impact wiped out the dinosaurs. It changed the whole ecostructure of the earth. And we can see now the issue of global warming and climate change. And we can go back and see the geological history of the earth and recognize the ice ages, and we can see what happened, and based on what happened in the past and understanding the science that we learned from studying it, we can see what is coming. And so, for example, there's an asteroid called Apophis that will pass within less than 20,000 miles distance from the Earth. Okay, and what is the moon? Like what, 93,000 miles or something like that? You look at whatever the distance of the moon is, and then look at this, that this is going to be much closer to the Earth than the moon ever gets. And this asteroid called Apophis. And many scientists will say, okay, well, right now, based on our calculations, there's no chance that it's going to hit the Earth. It's going to come close, though, but it's not going to hit. But of course, you know that they would never create global panic by telling everybody that the asteroid is about to hit everybody. They would classify that and try to figure out what to do to mitigate it so that no one will ever know. If they can figure out how to knock it off trajectory or destroy it or whatever with a nuclear blast. That's where we're at. We're at this stage in history where we have, like, for example, the Apophis asteroid. And then in about 150 years, there's what they call the Bennu asteroid that actually poses a potential threat to the Earth. And there are other asteroids that pose threats to the Earth that anything could happen that could impact them. You can have an asteroid hit by another asteroid that changes its trajectory, and so that it can crash into the Earth. So we are at a stage now where if you understand what's going on right now, there are thousands of satellites overhead in the sky. And these thousands of satellites monitor the surface of the Earth. They also look out into space. You have the Webb telescope. You had the Hubble telescope. And there's people all over the Earth in astronomical observatories who they're constantly watching what's going on. And while one side of the Earth is dark, there's groups of people watching and monitoring on the other side, because it's, in terms of, you look at what is happening, it's always a monitoring of what's going on and a watching. There are watchers. You hear about the watchers, the so-called watchers. People are watching because they're monitoring the sky. Because the history of man is that in ancient times, something may fall from the sky. You may have an asteroid to impact and wipe folks out, cause major catastrophic damage. If you go back and study the history of this is something that historically has been happening. And today, there are asteroids that come through the Earth's atmosphere and strike the surface every day. And most people are totally unconscious, oblivious of it, because very often it happens in places that do not, in fact, where there's no major population centers or in the ocean or whatever. And so there are also efforts to try to mitigate and damage and stop something that tries to come in that threatens a population center. So many people don't understand what the whole idea of planetary defense is about or recognize what's going on. You've got space agencies developing countries all over the world that their whole thing is to try to protect the security of the planet, to recognize the threats from outer space, such as asteroid impacts, to be able to see what would happen if a major asteroid broke through the Earth's surface and it didn't burn up before it struck the Earth's surface, that could cause catastrophic damage, similar to they had over in Siberia around 1908 or 1909. There was a major impact over Russia that leveled something like 800,000 square miles, where the trees were all down, then the whole area was damaged. So people don't really understand, the extent how serious this is. And this is why, like, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, you have what is called Baikonur, the Cosmodrome in Baikonur. And this is a major launch site for the international community. Launches most of its craft from the Baikonur, from the Cosmodrome. It's a major launch pad in a place where, that they can have in essence, a universal, a foundational science base, a base of operations, to launch from in terms of, mathematical coordinates. So in terms of looking at what is going on, that's something called the Near Earth Object Program that actually was a NASA project. This is an international project where they monitor the NEO program monitors asteroids in their trajectories and assesses their threat to the Earth as to whether or not they will strike the Earth. And they look at and measure the size of the asteroids and examine their trajectory. They also look at what they're made of. In addition to that, for example, the Japanese sent up a spacecraft, a robot ship, that actually traveled something like 180,000 miles. And it went and landed on an asteroid and took samples and brought them back to the Earth. And so this is the kind of technology that you have going on. They also have identified, like, for example, there's an asteroid that comes past on a regular course that carries within it, this asteroid has an estimated $4 trillion worth of titanium contained in the asteroid. So you have companies that are working to try to develop the capacity to mine the technology on the asteroid, to have mining ships to go and to be able to mine the titanium that exists on the asteroid. In terms of the works that they're doing in terms of traveling to Mars, and looking at the asteroid belt and all that, you have an effort now, a global effort where you have private companies now investing in being able to access the asteroid belt, because there are space rocks that contain pure gold and diamonds and emeralds and rubies and all kinds of minerals that have industrial applications, and that also could build space stations and all this. In terms of looking at and understanding, man has always been conscious of the fact that the earth may not last forever. Now, in the Bible, for example, it says that one generation comes and one generation goes, but the earth abides forever. But that may not actually be true. That may just be a cliche saying to give people comfort, because the reality is that we know the history that an asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs. And we can see that a global impact could actually have a devastating impact on the delicate balance of the atmosphere of the Earth, or that could cause such damage that the Earth loses its atmosphere altogether. And so in terms of looking at this and understanding this, and even looking at an asteroid that struck the moon, what would happen if a major asteroid struck the moon? And you understand the relationship of the moon to the earth and tides and how it maintains the balance, and how the ecosystem on the earth is helped balance because of the existence of the moon. What happened if the moon was struck by a major asteroid? You have people that are scientists working all around the world today to solve these issues, to look at how to mitigate any damage and how to maintain and sustain life on our planet, to maintain a balance so that our ecosystem can survive, so that we're not wiped out by pandemic diseases, so that we continue to make progress. If you look right now, think back 200 years ago when there was no automobiles, there was no airplanes, there was no modern technology like computers and some of the things that we see now, and some of the modern conveniences. Back then, people would have laughed at you if you talked about something like that, because it seemed something that was so far away that it was just a fantasy. It was something that could never be real, could never happen in the real world. But what has happened is you saw the automobile come along. You saw the aircraft come along. You then saw people go to the moon, into outer space. And yeah, you've got conspiracy theorists and people who say, oh, that never happened, it's fake and all of that, right? And you're always going to have people that have conspiracy theories and low intellectual functioning people. That's always going to exist. So some of those voices you have to disregard. You have to know what voices to, you listen to them once, assess their reality, and then you disregard them, and you recognize what they really are. And so in terms of, it's very significant for us to be able to really take the time to assess what is reality and where are we, and to be able to see the work of the global community. And yeah, you have people that are trying to loot money, like the Donald Trump and his group of people, and you got the warmongers, the people that are going to make money because they can explode bombs and do all kinds of atrocities, and they'll make money by manufacturing weapons and selling. But you also have people that are working toward life-sustaining things. You have people that are working toward the security of the planet. You have people that are working toward nanotechnology and that are studying nuclear medicine and electromagnetics and understanding the science of human progress. They're understanding how to sustain human life, how to maintain human life, how to establish and maintain an environment so that man can thrive and live and grow, and that we can continue as a species. And this is something that has been from the very beginning part of the burden of black leadership. And this is why black leadership has played the role that it has played throughout history, and why it's known and designated as the Ancient of Days, because we go all the way back to the very beginning, and we recognize, what the future is. We recognize the fact that as time moves on, that we have to maintain vigilance. We have to maintain consciousness. We have to grow and expand our consciousness and our ability to be able to gain mastery and control over the universe, over the world around us, over the environment, so that we can sustain, that we can survive as a species, as a group of people. And we've always recognized and always known that every group of people on this planet comes from us. They're the children of the original black people. And when we take a look at it, even the whole ideal of an original man, think of it now. If you went back 100,000 years ago to the first people that began to migrate out of the African continent, they would not look like any group of people that you see here on the earth today, black or white, or any other group. They would look completely different. They would be unrecognizable. You'd recognize them as humans, but you wouldn't recognize them as being distinctively any particular group of people that you see today. And so when we think in terms of an original man, that's just a false concept, that some of us made to say, okay, well, we're the black people, we're the original people. And what it is, it's an ego trip in order to make us feel good about ourselves. But if we really know the truth, it's something that's not necessary to make us feel good about ourselves. We should feel good of understanding who we are, the historical context we play, and the historical role that we played, and just surviving the slave trades, just surviving the African Holocaust makes us unique. It's like a pressure cooker that produced a group of people that are here today who stand tall, who stand strong, who are among the strongest people that have ever lived. And so in terms of looking at this and understanding the historical context and understanding black leadership and looking at the black leadership plan, it's important for us to understand Pan-Africanism and to be able to truly understand it in its global context, in the global meaning that it has, and the significance that it's had in terms of molding and shaping the global community, and particularly where it stands today in looking at the Africa Union in Region 6 in the Agenda 2063 program. And so I encourage you to take the time to do a little more research and study and examine this and explore it further. But when we look at this idea of a black leadership plan or black leadership plans, there are many different groups of black people with different plans. But overall, when we look overall, the goal of black people has always been the harmonious community, the beloved community, of building a global community of peace and harmony, where we all live together in peace and harmony. Be blessed and have a wonderful day. Thank you for taking the time to listen.